recent book, Teaching That Matters, Engaging Minds, Improving Schools. Frank writes because he believes it is important to hear from a dedicated teacher offering a philosophy of teaching that invites rather than accuses, encourages rather than criticizes, and offers creative choices rather than mandates. Frank, please remember to tell everyone your good news.
This is always a treat. On the day before my birthday last week, I received a book contract from Tom Kerner, Acquisitions Editor at Rowan and Littlefield, for my book, Teaching That Matters, Engaging Minds. Whoa. After more than 4 years of writing, needless to say, I'm thrilled to have someone want to publish my work. To give you an idea as to where I'm coming from as a teacher and writer, I will read a piece from the preface that describes a slice of my teaching life. It's the only place that Rowan and Littlefield allows writers to use the first person. I hope you enjoy it. Schools are best served by teachers who move beyond the traditional patterns and work alongside their students. From my first years in the early 1960s, I chose to be an innovative teacher. In my second year at a junior-senior high school, when I moved from the 9th to the 8th grade, I decided to teach Marxist communism from the inside. Pulling the shades on my windows and blocking the clear glass panel on my door, I spent a week practically preaching the virtues of Marxist Engels principles. Using stick figure diagrams and holding volatile question and answer sessions, I invited my students to internalize the virtues of the enemy's ideology. I reinforced it by having them spend a day the Soviet way, in Soviet school garb, and emulate the Soviet learning. It was a remarkable time. 10 years later, after teaching in an exemplary Oxfordshire, England progressive primary school, I established a middle school open classroom. You may remember that. I was fascinated with providing opportunities for students to become drivers of their own education inside rigorous expectations. For social studies, I took the board game Diplomacy that had been designed for 2 to 7 players and simulated it into a class-wide activity involving 20-plus students that lasted more than a month. The simulation was complete by having diplomats engage in intensive negotiations before making moves on the board, creating multiple alliances between countries, making secret agreements, and preparing propaganda posters that were scattered throughout the classroom. The game concluded with a diplomacy dinner in which students, most of who were not involved with the game, designed a menu based on different European cuisines and did all the cooking and serving. Another innovation from that time was restructuring the board game Monopoly into a socialist version I called Co-opoly. The rules specified that players were to play to win an equal share of money and real estate. It was a struggle for my students, but proved intriguing. I wish I had kept a copy of the rules. In the mid-1980s, when teaching social studies as part of a more traditional team of 4 teachers, I again revisited U.S. and Soviet relations. It was the time when Gorbachev's glasnost was tempting Americans like myself to travel to the Soviet Union and to see the enemy from behind the Iron Curtain. I ended up taking 8 trips, 3 of which I served as a teacher of English in Leningrad and Almaty, Kazakhstan. In my classroom at home, I wanted my students to see Soviet history as realistically as possible. Propaganda at that time was rampant from both sides. I decided to use George Orwell's Animal Farm as one way into the Soviet mind and its modes of operation. A remarkable feature of the book is that Orwell never mentions Russia or the Soviet Union. My students read one chapter per night, followed by class discussions the next day. I convinced them not to read ahead, so they could speculate on what might happen. After finishing the book, the pièce de résistance was offering students the option to re-enter the book at any part and rewrite it in any way they saw fit. One of the favorite choices turned out to be chapter 11, after Orwell's last chapter, chapter 10, and its infamous quotation, "The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But it was already impossible to say which was which." The futures that students envisioned may not have satisfied Orwell, but they did represent original thinking and often well-written essays. My final incarnation about teaching about Russians and the Soviets occurred in my last decade in the classroom with 8th graders in a private school. As part of our study, we spent considerable time examining the plight of peasants during the reign of Ivan IV. I asked students to take roles in Russian society and draft petitions to present to the Tsar. After thorough research and intense class discussions, including poring over texts written by Edward L. Keenan at Harvard, students prepared authentic-looking parchment petitions, often with burnt edges. When they presented their petitions to Ivan IV, a colleague disguised as the Tsar, they approached him reverently and dropped to their knees. The combination of designing authentic-looking petitions with well-researched information and dressing as peasants and nobles to face the Tsar and never turning their backs on him put them deep into early Russian history. These examples of breaking the traditional pattern of teaching from the front of the room illustrate that teaching can be a creative process with endless possibilities. By no means did I limit myself to Marxism, communism, Russian history, and the Soviet era. Throughout my career, in whatever grade or subject, I engaged students' minds, encouraged them to do their best, and invited them to express their knowledge in rigorous and creative ways. It was the only way I knew how to teach. Thank you.
So 2 years I made a comment that wouldn't it have been nice to have Frank as a teacher. I still think that. Thanks, Frank.